You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
This is Jayme Lemke. I'm a senior fellow with the Hayek program at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and it's my privilege this morning to be here, or whatever time of day you're listening to this. This is a podcast after all. But it's my privilege to be here with Karen Vaughn, Emeritus Distinguished Senior Fellow in the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, again here at George Mason University. But Karen, of course, has had a very long history with George Mason University, and I don't want to do too long of a bio because we could be here all day, because basically if there's anything important in history of economic thought or Austrian economics or political economy, Karen has been involved. Editing major journals, being a department chair here at George Mason during the time that public choice and constitutional political economy were really taking off as research agendas, and making her own significant contributions, including in her fantastic book, Austrian Economics in America, The Migration of a Tradition. So thank you so much for taking some time to chat here this morning, Karen.
Well, thank you for having me, Jayme. It's a privilege to be here.
And so I thought, kind of in honor of Women's History Month coming up, partially, but also just because it's an interesting set of questions that I don't think always get discussed very often, I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about some of your experiences working as a woman in economics at a time where that was not a particularly common thing. I know you have some research interests of your own that relate to women's rights and feminism, and I know you've thought a lot about these issues, about what it's like to be working as a woman and as a mother. So I want to circle around to all this stuff, but maybe as a starting point, since you've expressed interest in developing a pro-market view of feminism, I thought I might just ask a question I know that I get asked a lot, and get your answer. Do you consider yourself to be a feminist?
That's a very complicated question. So let me try to. I started off early in my career. I was one of the few, female students in my PhD program. Of course, there were 4 of us, but we were all very strong and very dedicated, and all did very well, in their professions. I got my first job, and there was only one other woman on the faculty, and this was the era, of the emergence of women's rights. Betty Friedan had written her book, and then Ms. Magazine came out, and I was a gung-ho feminist. By God, I was, take me seriously. This is kind of a silly story, but when Helen Reddy sang the song "I Am Woman," I used to play it and sing it out loud in my, in my home. So at that point, I did, and I thought, women in the workplace need to be treated at the same level as men. My first job in college, I was in Bloomingdale's, working as a salesperson, curious about retail careers, and I learned that executive trainees, men were paid $10 more an hour than women were. And I was incensed by that. I thought that was absurd, so.
And that was just the stated intentional policy?
Yeah, and I asked why, and they said, well, that's just the way it is, So that kind of prepared me for being, if not active, but very supportive of feminism.
Sure.
But, and I said this is a complicated question, because then feminism went off in a direction that I found totally incompatible with my understanding of the world. I mean, all of a sudden it wasn't just enough to go out and champion women's equality, but they wanted coercive measures to support it, and they started wanting a whole coterie of government programs that were going to, enforce this. And I kept thinking, this is not the way to go about it. by this time I was enough of an economist to know about unintended consequences, and and I thought, this is probably going to distort the progress of women. So I kind of distanced myself. I mean, I assumed I was equal to everybody else, and by God, you better pay attention to that. But I didn't. I stopped my crusading. Well, I didn't. I lost my crusading um, um, ambitions then. And so
So that trepidation about uh, feminism turning in the direction of looking for coercive measures in order to bring about outcomes that were felt to be more just or more fair, does that then does that connect at all to your interest in Austrian economics? Was that something that you had in mind at that time, or was that something you encountered later?
well, I mean, at this time, I was sort of interested in the Austrian school, but I considered myself a neoclassical economist,
Mm.
and so I don't think it was. It was more my libertarianism. I mean, I was a libertarian before I was an economist. I only studied economics because I wanted to figure out if I was right about how, the claims about markets that libertarians made, and I, so that was a, huge part of it. But the other part is kind of, I found an inconsistency in the way a lot of the feminists at that time thought. And it was, on the one hand, yes, women are equal and we just have to get out there and work. And the other one was, oh, give us special consideration because we're women. And I thought, you have to sort that out. And it was this whole thing of, are there gender differences or aren't there? And I thought in some areas there were, and you couldn't ignore that, but in other areas, you know, they were irrelevant. Well, let me tell you one study that came out in the Southern Economic Journal. The big issue about the 40% gap. Women only make 60% of what men make. And at first that's a very upsetting statistic, isn't it? But then I read this very careful study, and it was one of the first ones. Since then, there have been many, many more, but this was back in the late 70s. And they found once you controlled for education, hours of work, the jobs that women sought, most of that disappeared. And the interesting thing in that particular article that tended to convince me is that unmarried women without children did better than married men in the same jobs. So I'm thinking, well, this has something to do with life choices. It's not only, some big bad boss saying you're a woman, I'm not going to pay you as much. It has something to do with life choices, and we really needed to examine that, in greater detail.
Yeah, I didn't realize the literature had been finding that since the 1970s, because my understanding is that so as you said, there have been many studies, and some of them have made advancements on the initial methodology, and Claudia Golden's work has emphasized in particular the difference that being in a different industry or occupational path can have in terms of whether being either a woman or a woman with children will be any kind of particular disadvantage. But that's amazing. That's such a persistent part of what's been found. So that's, if it's okay, maybe we can jump and just talk here a little bit about the relationship between work and motherhood.
Yeah.
Because I think, and then we can come back to some of the, this other career history stuff. But this is one of the most contentious aspects of this conversation that we have today around women in the academy and in the workplace in general. Is, are workplace environments set up to be conducive for mothers to make productive contributions? Is this some kind of, to what extent is it an inevitable, avoidable trade-off that's always going to be a handicap for women that men are not necessarily going to face. And I think there's been a lot of productive conversation about trying to move in this direction of figuring out how professional work and motherhood can be compatible. But, as economists, there is this just deep understanding of the fact that women can't have it all, because nobody can have it all, because there are always trade-offs. There's no circumstance in which we get it all. So I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about some of your own experiences that you've had, both in terms of kind of witnessing and being a part of these conversations through your work career, but also just in your own life, because you chose to have children at a time that you were really doing a lot of work and being very active.
It's funny you use the phrase "women can't have it all," and because my young naive self, I thought, I'm going to have it all. I'm going to have this great marriage. I'm going to have this great family. I'm going to have this great career. I can do it. I am woman, And we didn't have children for 7 years of our marriage. And interestingly, those were my least productive professional years. And partly it was my own fault, and partly it was kind of disappointment in not having, a child when I wanted one. And so I never gave it a second thought, I got pregnant at a time when I was we had left Tennessee and moved to Washington, D.C., and we decided, okay, we'll go interview at the AEA meetings for jobs for the following year. And I showed up for my interviews vastly pregnant and lively going along. And I had an interview with one guy who really liked me. It was in a nice university. And he sort of very hesitantly asked me, well, what do you plan to do about your baby? Now, today, he would probably be sued for that. Yeah. At the time, I thought it was a reasonable question. Am I going to be as productive as some man he could hire? So I had my plan all worked out, and my husband and I both have careers. We can afford to hire childcare, so it was like a dream in my mind that all this was just going to work out unproblematically. Well, I have to tell you this story. So Jessica came along, and I put my desk in the family room with my typewriter and the playpen over in the corner. And I said, okay, she will sit in the playpen and play quietly by herself while I work. And then
I've done enough babysitting. I don't have children, but I've done enough babysitting to know that's not going to work.
It did not work at all. Reality hit me. But I mean, I don't know. I suspect most women feel this way. She was more important, so those needs came first. But I figured out a way to get some work done, and that is, she took good naps for a while. I worked during her naps. I worked at night, and then when she got a little bit older, I had a babysitter a couple hours of the day, and so I got my job. And it was, in a way, I was lucky because George Mason was not a hard pressing place at the time, and I think that's why, in some respects, my experiences might not be useful for women today, because I did a lot of writing, but I could do it in concentrated parts, mostly in my office, and at night I could deal with being a wife and a mother and a neighbor and piano player, and so and I did some of my best work in those first couple of years. But I have to say that it is not something. It is a difference between men and women. My husband was the greatest father, but he went to work. He had a job where he was out of the house 10 hours a day, and anything happened, it was up to me. Now, I had a job where if I needed to leave, I could say, I'll be back in an hour, and come, and I had flexible hours.
Right.
But I had to pick her up at the preschool 4:30 every afternoon. So if there was something that went on after that, it was, it just couldn't happen. So I guess I don't want to give you too much of my own personal biography, but it seems to me that I did have limitations. I had limitations in the amount of time, but it meant I had to work more efficiently. So maybe that is the trade-off. I didn't have as much time to hang around and talk to people, and then when I became chairman, my God, then I was going to meetings half of my life, and then it was really hard to keep my research program going. I would snatch time here and there, and I'm a thinker that has to sit for half an hour before anything comes in my head to write down. But I had colleagues, female colleagues, also had children, and I always wondered if maybe I was the only one struggling with this because they all seemed so serene. And it turns out, we were all juggling in a way that our male colleagues didn't. So I think that is a real issue. And how do you deal with it? That was the other part of your question.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that George Mason hadn't yet started, I'm not sure if they talked about it, and I'm not sure if they ever did, but it would be so handy to have daycare right at your site. Now, the problem with that, of course, is there are liability issues. And if you're, and I guess some big companies can do it, but they have to be very, wary about it. But that would have been so comforting to know it would take me 10 minutes to walk over to the daycare center if there was a problem. That would be nice. The other thing, and this was good about the first school I was teaching at, on the tenure track. Because that's a huge question for women. Do you have your children before you get tenure or after?
Right.
I mean, and I didn't have to worry about it because if you got a 1-year pregnancy hiatus and the clock stopped for a year, and that way, if then in that year you could kind of figure out how to do things, and then the clock ticked again. And I think that would be a sensible policy for any university. Because the fact of the matter is, children are not just the product of women alone. The husbands have something to do with it, and they don't get their tenure. They don't have to worry about the tenure clock.
Yeah.
Although I may be misjudging modern fathers because maybe they take a greater role in the rearing of children, at least the very young ones. But my suspicion is it's still going to be more of an issue for women. So stopping the tenure clock, for a year would be a great benefit. Because otherwise, think about your biological clock. You get out of graduate school, if you're lucky, you're 24, 25, maybe 26. And then let's say you get your great first job, and then you have 6 years, you're 32, maybe 33. Now, it's true, a lot of women have women in their mid and late 30s, but it's not a sure thing as when you're in your 20s. So I think that's another issue to balance. That's why I think an accommodation within the tenure process would be very helpful.
Yeah. One of the other proposals that I've heard that seems to have potential to me is that the way so much academic evaluation happens right now is hyper-focused on quantity rather than quality. There's the quip, deans might not have time to read, but they have time to count.
Oh God, you have pressed my button. When I was department chair, I would look at some of my colleagues who were turning these annual reports, like 10 articles, often with many co-authors, and off of them, each one like a little tiny bit of something that had, all right, a mini marginal contribution to anything anybody cared about. But the long project, the deep think, you don't do 10 of those in a year. Well, Pete does, but he's different. But very few can do that.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I was the kind of person who had to think a long time before I could start writing, and I always said I never knew exactly what I thought about anything until I started writing it. And then I'd revise it like 16 times. So I was a slow producer. I am happy to say that just about everything I thought was good got a lot of recognition. So maybe there's a benefit to being a slow thinker. But I do think that emphasis on counting up articles is detrimental to not just to women, but to anybody who wants to take on a really significant project. And I think that's probably worse in economics than maybe some other disciplines, but I'm not an expert in the other disciplines, so I'm not sure.
Right. It's intuitive that it might be just because of the journal focus rather than
Yeah,
the
and
space for book projects.
and I always thought, I've only published 2 major books, but I was always thinking in book projects. I was. One of my colleagues one time said, "You put too many ideas in an article. Parse it out. You could have 4 articles here." But they all hung together, so I didn't know how to do that.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a feminine characteristic. I don't know.
Let's talk. You brought up the group, your administrative work, and we were chatting earlier this week, and you were telling me about the group of women that you worked with at that time who were also department chairs, and so could you say a little bit more about that work? And actually, maybe let's take it back a little bit to kind of lead into it, because you started your PhD program at Duke in the 60s. So this was not a time in which there were a great number of women enrolled, and this is not too long after UCLA had denied Eleanor Ostrom admission to their economics PhD program because of her gender. So that this was not a time where it was maybe all that common. So maybe you could talk a little bit about just what your experiences were at Duke and the classrooms there, whether being a woman was specifically an issue or something that was discussed, and then and then maybe we can go on to talk a little bit about how that might have changed, given that there does seem to be so much more openness by the time you get to George Mason in the. Did you arrive in the 80s?
78.
78.
Yeah. Well, the Duke experience was actually very positive to me. There were 4 women in the program. I think maybe 12 men, maybe 6 more than that. I don't remember the exact count, but it was kind of a joke. Oh yeah, they let in 4 women every year, so it kind of snickered about that. But of the 4 of us, we were all good performers. There was I never felt any being singled out in class. Well, there was one little creep of a teacher, but he got fired. So, but other than that,
markets work.
Yeah. But you were in the class, you did your work, you were graded, and we all did really well in the program. And it was not because we got any special favors. So I felt I didn't have any sense of being any different. Let me put it that way. My roommate and I became fast friends. We're still friends. We both had really successful, academic careers. One of them went into one of the agencies, think tank kind of thing, did really well. The 4th one I kind of lost touch with. But so I just assumed, life was rosy. I got into this great program. I got full ride fellowship, never had to pay a nickel. Got a job right out of graduate school without even having my PhD, because in those days all you needed to do was be in the dissertation stage and they would hire you. And my husband and I got jobs at the same school. So I didn't have any problems. I got to Tennessee. There was one other woman on the faculty who I greatly respected, and boy, she brooked no nonsense. But the chairman one time said, he wasn't chairman yet, one of the colleagues said, until you came, women had to do their own typing. The secretaries didn't do it for them. So I looked at him and said, that's appalling, He said, and I'm thinking, what is this? This is nonsense.
Yeah.
And so, but my attitude was always to dismiss these people as not worth my attention and just plow on. And I had no trouble in classrooms. And I had mostly males in the classroom. So I really can't say that I've ever felt my academic career was hindered because I was a woman. I think maybe it was benefited. There were so few women. If people remembered me, So I think the real issue that I guess troubles some people today is, why are there so few women going into economics? And I've thought long and hard about this. I have no great answer to it, and this gets you into really, dangerous territory. But economics is a way of thinking about the world, and it might not be congenial, not just to women, but a lot of men too. It's a very specific way of looking at actions and consequences and choices, and it's a framework you have to jump into and make it part of your own. And it appealed to me, we one time took Myers-Briggs test, and I was way down on the bottom corner, INTJ. Well, it turns out like 2% of women in the world are INTJs, only 4% of men, something really like that. So I said, that explains why so many people tell me they hated economics, But what is interesting to me is how the Austrian program has attracted more women. And it's still analytic, it still requires you to think, but it also allows you to explore outside of a narrow model. And I think that may be something that's more attractive to people, dare I say, with more imagination. Sure. And it's a language, and one of the things about I found early on as economists is you didn't use the right words, and you were dismissed, and so you learn to use a particular language, where Austrians are more open about the language that they use, and so if there's any truth to the argument that women are more language oriented than men, that might have something to do with it. But anyway, I think it's wonderful, and I think it's something that should be imported into the rest of the profession.
So you said that your colleague in Tennessee brooked no nonsense. Yeah. And you seem to me like someone who probably doesn't put up with too much yourself. So I guess my question is, do you think that kind of attitude is helpful when you're trying to step into a space that maybe doesn't always feel particularly welcoming? Do you think there's a bit of a selection effect in that the early cohorts of women moving into a particular space, it's going to be kind of extra important? But I mean, I think kind of maybe it's something that still helps today, no matter where you are. But
well, I mean, it's a sense of self-confidence, and you have to have the self-confidence that you know your stuff. And I have to say, whenever I was talking about a paper or something that I wrote, I always felt I know this, That isn't to say I always had an enormous amount of self-confidence, but I could project it over anything about work that I'd done. Too many women, students actually, and some students, they'd be a little shy to speak up in class. Or I had a graduate seminar, and really smart young woman, every smart young woman, and she would start with, well, I don't know if this is right, and I'm not sure. And finally, she reminded me, I said this to her, I said, you never maximize your career achievements by being self-deprecating. And that's something I had to learn too, because my male colleagues never had any problem telling you how great their work was. Or another thing I didn't do that took me the longest time, assigning my own work in graduate classes. I'm thinking, that's just calling too much. That's being, too arrogant, oh, blah, blah. Then every other one of them has like 6 of their own articles that the graduate students have to read. And I thought, I'm really missing out, you know.
Yeah.
So I started doing that.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I had that same, not so much about my work, but kind of this worry that maybe I don't want to sound like I'm too aggressive. You know, I got over that in a big way, just because you had to fight your way to, you know, to get there. But it's something I would advise all my female students. As far as I can tell, looking around here, the women here don't have that problem.
No, I don't think we have a lot of wallflowers here in this program. So do you think that this attitude is something that you were able to then carry into your administrative work? And when you went into that space, you know, with, you know, you started out listening to, you know, I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar, and then, you know, you went
singing it.
Yeah, singing it. And then you went to this amazing PhD program. So you not only have the confidence that you know your stuff, but you actually know your stuff. And so then when you went into the administrative space and are trying to do this kind of program building, and I know you did a lot of work bringing Jim Buchanan to George Mason University, did you find that that was productive for you and respected?
No and no, but important, you know, because the reason I was asked to be chair of the department is because I brought Jim Buchanan in the Public Choice Center, and I negotiated all of those, basically back and forth between the administration and Jim about the particulars of the move. And so the dean said, gee, how about you be chairman? And Jim loved the idea because he trusted me. So, and I thought, well, I'll do it for a year or so and get out of it, because I was really starting to cook on my research program. I mean, and I had a lot of ideas I wanted to work on, but no, I had to be chairman, and I had no idea how much work that was.
I see. So in some sense, you were a bit of a victim of your own competence.
Yeah, I should never have negotiated that deal so much. Yeah. But I did find, although there's a lot of busy work, there are things about it I really liked. I've discovered over the years that I like being in charge, you know, of myself, and you know, and I've had to learn to step back a little bit. But in those years, I learned so much about how the university worked. And that's something that if you're isolated in a department, especially then, I don't think that's Mercatus's problem so much, and then you could be in your own little enclave and think the whole world revolves around you, and you're the most, and that was the attitude of a lot of people in the economics department. We're the best department, you know, and they just have to recognize it. Well, as chairman, I went to meetings with the dean and all the other chairmen once a month, sometimes more when there was a problem, and I'd listen to all the others. And it gave me an appreciation for how a university as a whole worked and the constraints they're under. And that was something I had a hard time conveying to a lot of my colleagues, that they didn't give us more money, not because they didn't like us, but there's so little money to go. Well, why did they give it to the English department? Well, you can't have a university if you don't have an English department, you know, that kind of thing. And I had a really collegial almost a more collegial relationship with the administration and the other chairs than I had with some members of my department. So I always felt that while I would have preferred not to do it, that I was representing the department in an effective way and making friends. I mean, economists don't go out of their way to make friends with people in other departments. And I thought that, you know, especially considering that they all thought we were crazy right-wing nuts, you know, and I wanted to disabuse them of that and to bring some an attitude of respect for their work, and then, you know, demand an attitude of respect for ours. And I think I was pretty successful, at least with a lot of people. I mean, you mentioned my female chair friends, and we forged a real bond during those years. in the College of Arts and Sciences, when I first became chair, there were 7 female chairs of important departments.
Wow.
You know, economics, philosophy, history, psychology, art history, and then there was one other. I can't remember what the other one was. That's 5. I'm missing somebody, but at any rate,
You'll think of it
English.
some English.
Okay.
So was there a coordinated effort by anybody in the leadership of the university at that time to try to bring in more women, or was this purely something that emerged as an artifact of who the best people in the area happened to be?
Yeah, I don't think there was a little bit of a concerted effort. I mean, universities started to be under pressure for hiring more women. And I'll tell this story on me, but when I interviewed, I had 3 offers, and I gave a really good talk, and the department didn't have a lot of people doing much research at the time, and they were very young. And I came highly recommended by Jim Buchanan, and so, I got the job figuring, and I looked around, and the other person in the department who I thought was really good was another woman, so we became friends. And years and years and years and years later, at Snavely gave a talk. It was actually at a memorial service for one of my colleagues, and he said, when early on the president told us we had to hire another woman, and we were so lucky because we hired Karen, and then we had to hire another African American, and we were so lucky we hired Walter. Well, Walter and I both went, our mouths dropped open, and I was the next person up. I thought, what do I say? So I said, Bill, you know what? If I had known how much pressure you were under to hire me, I would have held out for a lot more money. and everybody laughed. So that was the first I ever heard of it. And I have to say, I was a little offended because I deserved that job on my own merits. And I felt like this school would be, lucky to get people like me to come in. I mean, again, that sounds a little arrogant, but I looked around and I thought, I know I'm at least as good or better than anybody here. So that's one of the reasons I've always had a little problem with affirmative action programs. They haven't been the disaster that I predicted initially. Mm-hmm. I mean, making people aware that women have a lot to say is probably a good thing. And Walter used to talk about this all the time, too. There's always this little worry. Did they hire me because I'm a woman or because they thought I was good? Am I a compromise? Now, it turns out, after my career here, I don't think anybody would claim I was a compromise. But, had I been told that in the beginning, it would have undercut, my confidence a little bit. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
No, that's fantastic. And that's a phenomena that a lot of, especially early recipients where it's made clear to them that they're the beneficiaries of affirmative action, I think that's not an uncommon kind of reaction to report. And it's a difficult problem. So Shelley Lundberg is an economist, and she's said there's a lot of talk in economics about wanting to promote women, and there is pressure from administrations and all of this, but economists don't really do affirmative action because they're very committed to the idea of getting, the research is a priority, getting the right people into the right departments. So kind of that's her response to people who claim that when they see a woman in a position, she's only been asked to be there because of her gender. Her response is, economists don't go in for that.
No, they don't do that. No.
Yeah.
And I respect that. I mean, I really do. You get the best person. And I have to say, there are a lot of really, really sharp women in the economics profession. I don't think you can count up bodies, and say, you need 50% or something like that. There's self-selection, as we talked about earlier, and self-selection matters. And as I said, when it comes to evaluating my work and publishing, I never felt that there was any kind of consideration of the fact that I was a woman. That just I don't know that that's in other departments, but I certainly felt that here with journals or anything like that. Yeah.
It is a tricky problem though, because as much as I see the dangers in emphasizing too much gender and trying to make professional decisions, I also see the argument that there can be value in representation and having somebody that you can look up to who looks like you. I think back to the early history of women's rights, and Susan B. Anthony, one of the reasons why she developed the idea she had about how intellectually capable and productive and responsible women could be is that she, when she was growing up, her father owned a textile mill for about a decade, a couple mills actually, and she saw the women working and that they were good at it and they could manage their finances and do. So she saw women doing things that it was not commonly accepted were normal roles for them, and it changed her attitude. So do you think that this argument about representation and role models has merit? Is it worth considering?
It is, and I've come to this over time. Thinking about it. My mother was a very strong woman. She went back to work when I was 13, and just started as a secretary and wound up as an office manager, and that my first real economics course was micro theory, taught by a woman who was co-author of the textbook we used. And I was the only young woman in the class, but she was the teacher. And, I don't think I said to myself, oh boy, a woman can be an economist. But it did make an impression on me. Actually, I had another woman who taught money and banking, but she was a flake. But I mean, but there were male flakes too. So I didn't, So, and then I went to graduate school, and there were no females teaching. And Juanita Krebs was there, but she was on leave. But by then, it just never occurred to me that there was any problem, with me being in an environment taught by men.
Sure.
But I do think when I was teaching, there would be women who would come up and talk to me. They wouldn't ask about women's issues, but I think they felt comfortable. I tried to teach a course once called Women in Economics, and it didn't. And I had 6 young women in the class, and it was okay. And I was mostly talking about how markets are beneficial to women and stuff like that. But it was never a focus of my career. But I do think you have a point about seeing someone, as you say, looks like you and faces many of the same issues in life that you do, who's also successful. I'm sure if I could turn the question over to you. Was it important for you?
Yeah, I think it was important for me. And I've also observed it, I think, being important for students. And so sometimes when I give guest lectures at outside universities, there's always a Q&A session after you give a talk. And I've sometimes had questions only from women. And I ask my male colleagues, how often do you go give an economics lecture and have all the questions or most of the questions be from the young women in the audience? And they say never. It's almost always because usually you expect after a lecture it's going to be that overly aggressive guy who thinks he knows everything about economics who wants to get up and tell you. But I get, like you said, a lot of women feeling like they can talk to me. But I didn't really have female professors in economics. I'm trying to make sure that I didn't forget anybody, but it wasn't really until starting to work with you at conferences and with Bobby Herzberg coming and joining the Hayek program that I had some kind of female mentors, and her coming here actually did kind of change my mind on this issue as well, because there were things that, as close as I am to other of my colleagues and mentors, that I just wasn't all that comfortable talking about with them.
Yeah. When I first started teaching, I used to like to read. I mean, I was brand new married, setting up a household, and I liked to read women's magazines, but I'd hide them. I didn't want any of my colleagues ever to see me reading anything like that, Then I finally decided that was a job too, and you had to have skills for both jobs. So.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But we talked about this earlier, and I've talked about how I never felt any discrimination about my work, but it isn't like it was a smooth ride the whole way.
Right.
And part of it was my colleagues, and I had a lot of really good colleagues, but I had some that I think definitely resented the fact that I was in charge of the department. And I only bring this up because it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. It was the younger ones, and it wasn't the people, my contemporaries, and especially people I had come to know teaching here. But the younger ones sort of, it's almost they came in with this brash attitude, the typical, young economist attitude, and they really didn't like it, having any kind of direction from me. And I wasn't very good at handling them because I thought this was kind of surprising and frankly insulting, And there were a couple of people in the public choice department that I think had a real problem with me. But I was sort of in a protected position because I had the 800-pound gorilla, Buchanan, in my corner. But
always nice to have a Nobel Prize winner or a future Nobel Prize winner in your corner.
But I can see it's not an overt thing, but sometimes there is this sort of skepticism. And I had one younger colleague. I gave a paper at one of the faculty seminars, and he asked. Not only did he ask dumb questions, but in the most insulting way possible. And it was clear he was just going to be so disdainful and show how much smarter he was, and he was all wrong, But I think this is illustrative of a way of dealing with this. I didn't get mad. I didn't get my hackles up. I just apologized for being unclear and saying, let me help you by clarifying what I meant to say, and I think that was an attitude that is useful. You don't take them on. You're just as dispassionate as possible, and I, indirectly, put him in his place. But I think, and I haven't actually seen that very often, but there were a couple of younger people in this department who were just nasty to me, and of course they could have been nasty to men too. Who knew,
Yeah, I always struggle with that question myself, because academia in general is a place where there is pettiness and jealousy and, people who, and not everybody, but there are people who have academic careers who maybe have not really worked jobs where there were real consequences to poor performance before.
Exactly.
You can get away with bad behavior in a way you maybe can't in other environments. So is someone behaving badly to me because I'm a woman, or just because they would find any reason to behave badly to me?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I can't tell.
Yeah, and so I think my takeaway from that is, don't assume it's because you're a woman. Just assume it's because they're jerks. And then you just go about your business. Because I at one time thought, well, if you're not, let's say you're a person not having a lot of success in your career, you can either say, oh, it's because they don't like me because who I am, gender, race, ethnicity, or something like that. Or you can say, gee, maybe I haven't worked hard enough. Now, the first one might be true, but the second one is the strategy that's going to help you in either case. So I just,
Right.
You just assume that, you just got to work harder. Now, of course, that leads to the issue of, well, do women have to work harder than men? And I don't know. It seems to me the women I know in the economics profession are, they're great. Um, I don't know that they worked harder than their colleagues, or maybe they work smarter, or maybe there's no difference. How do you measure something like that? I don't really know.
I don't know either.
Okay, let's move on.
Well, before we wrap up, I want to come back to kind of a broader question that we had on the table at the beginning, and this might be kind of a nice place to end the conversation. But since we are economists, and wanting to try to understand, how in general it is that we can live in a society that brings out the best in everybody. Mm-hmm. So, kind of the women, but also just, everybody living in that society in general. I thought we might circle back a little bit to this idea of pro-market feminism that we started with, kind of in the beginning. And so I think sometimes these criticisms about gender in the workplace wind up being extended into being broader criticisms about work itself, about capitalism itself, about, whether, within a market economy and within a wage labor economy, if this is destructive of family. And so, I was hoping maybe you could offer some thoughts just on general in whether markets are good for women and good for families, and if there are, if these are not costs of market activity, but maybe instead there might actually be some benefits to kind of to family, and benefits in terms of equality that actually come out of the market, rather than the market purely presenting challenges on these margins.
Gee, that's a big question. We have 5 minutes. Well, I mean, obviously, I would be pro-market, and partly from an historical perspective. I mean, markets did so much to really liberate women from drudgery. And one time I was starting a paper. I never finished it, but it was starting off with the premise that women always worked. Working women is not a new thing. They just worked at different jobs. And if you're thinking the people who find old peasant existences idyllic should just see the backbreaking work that women have had to do. I mean, because running a household was like running a business. And what markets do is give you more choices. But not only do they give you more choices, they give you more innovation. And the innovation has made that drudgery of, washing the clothes in a wash tub outside in the backyard, has turned it into throwing in a washing machine, turning a switch, and then going out to work. To me, this is a no-brainer. I don't disparage markets. I celebrate them, because all of us. If I had been born, even when my mother was, I would not have gone to college, because it's a waste. My father said to me, "What's the point of you going to college? You're just going to go get married." And my mother, of course, jumped all over him on that, and I ignored him, and I went off. Not only go to college, not only get a PhD, wound up supporting him in his old age. And I said to him, "Well, you glad I went to college now?" But that would have been.
Did he change his tune?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not there. He has a whole different background. I mean, it was a different ethnicity, But I've been thinking, if I had been born like 30, 40 years before, my life, I wouldn't have had a career. Maybe I would have been a school teacher. And even my mother said to me, get a teaching degree. You can always have something to fall back on. Well, with that, every nurse or teacher, that's what we were told, when we were really young. And I don't know why I never thought I was going to limit myself to that. I was, I did well in school, and I was growing up at an age where people weren't all hyper aware of women and things, but I had a good education, and markets can give you the wherewithal to have good education, to have choices, to, I'm not so happy about social media, but, there's communication, that lets you know what opportunities are. And yeah, there are challenges to family, so I don't want to paint this overly rosy picture, because when you have, if two, and God, this is a whole other podcast, but if you have two, a husband and a wife, both on super hard charging careers, then unless they have very dedicated nannies, I don't see how the kids, are adequately incorporated into their lives. And I think that is a real issue. So it might be that maybe you can't have two CEOs in the family. Or if you have two CEOs in the family, then you have the faithful household retainer, but they don't exist much anymore. So I think that's a challenge. The other challenge I see is the kind of differences in parenting styles. When I grew up, I went out to play, came home at dinner time. When my daughter grew up, we managed to have pretty much the same. We lived in a neighborhood. She could go out and play, and now there are soccer teams, there's swim team, there's play dates. Kids don't just go out and play. You have to arrange play dates and sleepovers, and your whole life could be absorbed with those activities. I live in Georgia, and there are a lot of well, I wouldn't say that, maybe more not women not employed outside the house, but even the ones who have jobs and all, their whole weekends are tied up driving their kids in different places. So I'm not sure that's a good development. I don't think there's any political remedy for this, and I don't think a socialist a socialist government is going to improve on it much, because the cost of regulating and bureaucratizing is limiting choices, limiting innovation, and regimenting schools. I mean, you look at the schools in some of even the highly touted Scandinavian countries, and parents have almost no say in what goes on in the school systems. Well, at least that's what my Norwegian relatives tell me, because I don't have firm evidence on this, just hearsay. But so I mean, my bottom line is, when you ask, is it a benefit? And I'm an economist. Compared to what? What's the alternative? And any alternative I can think of is a whole lot worse, which may not be something to cause people to go marching with banners down the road, but it's a realistic assessment of the human condition. If there is no ideal in the world, there is only the best you can get, and markets give you the best shot at getting the best you can get.
Well, thank you so much. This has been Karen Vaughn, and we're all very grateful that you never did limit yourself. And we'll follow your example and do the same. So thank you very much for talking today.
Well, thank you, Jayme. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.